presenting a paper that I wrote for Dr. Siebel's human security class, along with Rosa Maria Ponciano, and she apologizes for not being here today because she actually is doing another talk at IUP on some migrant issues in the Pittsburgh area, which is kind of like her day job. Okay, just so for any of you that don't have a background in human security, it seems kind of vague, so I thought I would just go over it quickly. The idea of human security really has its origin in the UN Development Program's Human Development Report from 1994. Chapter 2 is called New Dimension of Human Security, and that's where it covers all these issues. Basically, what human security encompasses is the transition from traditional security, like state security, national security, that focuses on macroeconomic indicators and things like that, to security of individuals and communities. So this necessarily expands the scope of human security to the point that the entire concept of human security is debated academically as to whether it's useful, because it is in fact so broad. The 7 dimensions that the UNDP points out, and I'll be focusing on 4 of them, are political, economic, community, health, personal, environmental, and food security. I don't think you need definitions of those, but we can. So in this paper, we're just taking a broad approach to human security. And the big difference is that the narrow approach basically is freedom from fear. So if you have your basic needs met, you are secure. If you have a broader approach to human security, it's also freedom from want. So feeling like you have economic security and chance for opportunity, and basically that within a reasonable expectation, you can live, your conception of the good life. So a little bit of background about Guatemala, which is what this the human security presentation is on. From 1960 to 1996, there was a civil war that was identified as a genocide by a lot of folks in Guatemala, mostly civil society groups, but the UN never pointed that out. The deaths and disappearances during this time topped 200,000, and the majority of these were indigenous Mayans that lived in the highland and rural areas. Estimates of people that were displaced go up to 2 million. Just a little something to note about kind of Guatemala's place in Latin America. It fits within a general trend that we see in Latin America in the late 20th century, which is basically that like the civil conflict trend, the socioeconomic and geographic divisions that are a result of basically the colonial legacy that pitted indigenous people against mestizos. There are big issues with land reform, private property rights or lack thereof, and also ideological leftist indigenous rebel groups, as you talked about in your presentation on Peru, kind of being juxtaposed against rightist governments generally backed by the United States. So we're going to look at 2 snapshots in human security in Guatemala to kind of evaluate whether it got better or worse with this genocide in the middle. 1982 was the most violent year of the civil conflict, and 2005 represents the year that Managua, the UN mission to Guatemala, left. So ostensibly, if they left, things should have been better. So we're gonna test that. Just a little bit about our data and our methodology. Like I said, we measured in 1982 and 2005. We collected our data from Guatemala and then from Central America as a whole. Just for the purposes of this, it's Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. So not Mexico, that's North America, but a lot of people kind of think of it as Central. The 4 indicators that we chose were political security, economic security, personal security, and health security. And for each of those, we identified 2 variables that we were going to measure. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to justify why we picked those. But for political security, we did voter turnout and score on the political terror scale, which is something that SIPRI, which is a peace research institute in Stockholm, came up with. Just as a side note, the U.S. is currently at 3 because of Guantanamo Bay, so to kind of put everything in perspective, with 5 being the worst and 1 being the best. For economic security, we picked inflation and GDP measured by purchasing power parity. Personal security, deaths by assault, which I don't know why they call them that, those are murders. And migration rates, and these are going to be net migration rates. So when they're negative, people left the country. When they're positive, people came into the country. And health security, infant mortality, and life expectancy. So just a little bit about exactly how we calculated these. For each individual variable, so say for the political terror score, we normalized it by taking the actual value, which we found in Guatemala, subtracting it from the minimum value, which would represent the minimum value found in all of these Central American countries during that time, and divided it by the maximum in Central America minus the minimum. This is a pretty standard form. The UN uses it. It's a good way to normalize variables. And then for negative indicators, because a lot of these things that we're measuring are bad, so the higher, you wouldn't want to get a higher human security score for having more murders. So we just subtract them from 1 to kind of reverse it. We get our full indicator by adding the variables for either 1982 or 2005 together and then dividing them by 2. It's pretty simple math. And then the final human security number, which kind of gives you the picture of the country on that year, we add them all up and divide by 4. So this is going to go anywhere from 0, which is a complete lack of human security, to 1, which is a total fulfillment of human security. But keep in mind that these are relative because they're situated within a Central American context and not specific to the individual countries. So this is just the political security chart that we found. I'm not going to go over each of these numbers independently because I have 3 more of the exact same type of charts. But just note the highest and the lowest for each one. So Guatemala and El Salvador both got a 5 on the political terror chart, which is pretty bad. Costa Rica had a 1 both years. And then you can also look at the voter turnout. And Guatemala is also pretty low on political security there. So from looking at the chart and knowing that we have a pretty simple formula, you can almost anticipate what the exact figures are going to be. And where you see a dash, those are empty spaces. Data wasn't available. I'm going to come back to that later. So all of that stuff, the first 2/3 of the slide, we already went over it. The only thing you need to focus on are the bottom 2, which give us the results. So political security in 1982 got a whopping 0.0, and then 2005 improved to 0.06, so pretty low in both times. With economic security, we have a similar chart, which takes GDP measured by purchasing power parity in US dollars, so what they would be able to afford comparable to what we can afford here with that income, and also inflation ratio. Notice that Guatemala was substantially ahead of all of the other countries in both time series. So this is going to allow, with the formula we use, Guatemala to look really good in the beginning and really bad at the end because there's only so much room for growth when you're talking about the relative context of Central America as a whole. And then inflation rate, it also had pretty low inflation rate compared with, if you look at Costa Rica, 9% inflation rate. So for this indicator, we had like I said, because their scores were so high, because they represent the actual value and the maximum value is the same when Guatemala is at the top. So in 1982, they scored a 1, and then in 2005, they scored a 0.72. This might seem counterintuitive because it went up, but because it's embedded within development growth in the rest of the region, they didn't grow or expand as much as the other ones. So they weren't able to improve that as much. For personal security, we're going to look at murders and migration rate. I think the first thing that you're all going to notice is that there's a complete lack of data, and this is actually the best that we were able to find. And we're going to come back to why murders are the worst data available. It has to do with incentives for reporting and who collects the information. Also with the migration rates, just note again that negatives mean that net 10%, 10.8% in the case of El Salvador left the country, and that's compared with their domestic population. And for personal security, we had a 0.34 represented in 1982, which is pretty low, but it hasn't risen much as now in 2005 to a 0.45. So to get this last indicator out of the way, then we can do some analysis. When we look at health security, we see Nicaragua at the top, Costa Rica at the bottom, Guatemala close to the middle, not where we want it, obviously. And then life expectancy in years. And if you look at these numbers compared to almost any other region of the world, with the exception of maybe Southeastern Asia, you would be really surprised. I mean, probably not because you're here for a reason, but these numbers are really, really high for infant mortality rate and pretty low for life expectancy. So with health security, we're looking at 0.16 in 1982 and 0.18 in 2005. So it went from bad to not quite as bad. So not much positive to report there. I'm going to go over some qualitative and quantitative conclusions and then kind of talk more about the study in general. So when we normalize all of these variables and add them up and compare them to the Central American context as a whole, we see that in 1982, Guatemala had a human security index of 0.39. So not even half where you want to be to completely fulfill levels of human security. And then it actually got worse. And you would think that if they had a genocide, things would tend to get better after the genocide. That's not what we found. And it lowered to 0.35 in 2005. So rather than focus on kind of policy implications, I just kind of want to go over the methodology and the data. The first thing I want to stress is like the relativity of this kind of data. Because the index measures development and human security within the Central American context, we're not looking at absolute improvement. If you've noticed looking at these charts, even though I sped through them, almost all countries improved absolutely. So this isn't to say that things aren't getting better. This is just to put Guatemala within a Central American perspective and say, are they doing as much as their neighbors in improving some key development indicators? So this paper might seem like the odd one out, especially in this panel, because it focuses so much on data and methodology and not a lot on policy. But I think that this kind of focuses exactly what we need to connect the analysis of problems with policy recommendations, because we can't understand or correct problems or even say that there is a problem without understanding the size, the urgency, the scope of the problem. So if this was going to be some kind of dissertation, which it obviously wasn't, what we would do is we would get all of this data, compile a complete human security index, and then run a regression on it and basically see what, if any, government policies led to improvements or disprovements in the levels of human security. And I think another important thing to remember about Guatemala is the majority of gains were not made by government. They were made by individuals and civil society organizations. So it seems that the more that the government actually influences policy, it's normally negative in this context at least. The majority of growth that they're experiencing in the development sector is from private and nonprofit organizations. Another thing that I hope you guys took from this was the complete lack of data. I know that this seems like a really simple conclusion to me, but these numbers are really hard to get, and there isn't such a thing as a human security index. That's why our job was to create one. So there are obviously problems with the model. We might want to weight them if one is more important than the other one. But we're not going to be able to talk about the policymaking process, and this is never going to get to a desk of a policy analyst or a policymaker unless we can get an idea, again, of what the real issues are. I guess in terms of recommendations for the UN, you would look for them to get more reliable data, but there's a paradox here where you're asking countries to report how many people were murdered or how many people emigrated. Countries don't want to report that, and the reason that it's obviously a paradox because we're trying to solve problems, and those problems, especially within human security issues, are caused by the government. They're not states going to war with one another. It's civil conflict. So you're asking governments that are complicit in the destruction of their own people to let you know how badly they're doing. So this kind of data is really difficult to collect, and I'm not really sure where to go with it in the future, just to know that the bright side is that we have a lot of multilateral institutions, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs that are taking a really good look at this type of data, and we're getting accurate numbers now for the first time. There was almost nothing available up until the 2000s, and then things started to get a little more reliable there. So that is the conclusion. I appreciate you coming.